Except you have to look at your notes. Who was the senator that decided that Mike Mansfield, very good, okay. All right, so again, like we said yesterday, so much attention came about this Watergate scandal and the controversy that surrounded it that it forced the Senate to take some action. And what the Senate did, the Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield of Montana organized a committee to investigate the happenings at the Watergate complex. Okay, so that's what they're investigating. What happened at the Watergate complex? And that was initiated through the Senate by Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield. Now, he had to have a vote in the Senate to do that. He just couldn't do it himself. So what he did is he set up a proposal or a proposition or made a motion, so to speak, that the Senate investigate the happenings at the Watergate complex. And so the Senate voted on. There were 77 members of the Senate. Guess what the vote was? 77-0. So every single member of the United States Senate voted to organize the committee and begin the investigation of the happenings at the Watergate complex. Now, what do you have to have when you have a committee? I'll get it right here. What do you have to have? A what? A chairman. And the chairman of this Watergate committee was a senator from North Carolina by the name of Sam Ervin. Sam Ervin. And he will chair this Senate committee to investigate Watergate. Sam Ervin.
Where is he from?
North Carolina. Sam Ervin of North Carolina. Well, this investigation by this committee began in May of 1973, and it was televised nationally. So in May of 1973, the Senate Watergate Committee began their investigation of what happened at the Watergate complex, and they were nationally televised. People watched on TV daily. Well, the first people that were investigated were who? Not the 5 men that were in there, but what organization, think back to the Watergate complex, did they investigate first to see what their actions were? The committee to re-elect the president. So during these hearings, they investigated the committee to re-elect the president. Who was the chairman of that committee? G. Gordon Liddy. Remember, John Mitchell resigned as what? Director, okay? Now, they found many wrongdoings on the part of the committee to re-elect the president. I'm going to give you 5 examples of things they did during the campaign of 1972, right? Because that's what this all is about. When Nixon overwhelmingly defeated McGovern for president, okay? So that's what they're investigating. What did the committee to re-elect the president do during that election process? Well, here's four things they did, and some of them are pretty childish, actually. One thing the committee to re-elect the president did is they released mice during Democratic press conferences. So when the Democrats were having press conferences during the election of 1972, members of the committee to re-elect the president actually released mice during those conferences to try to disrupt things. Nixon told them to do whatever possible to make sure he won. That's one thing they did. Another thing they did is during Democratic rallies like Mary went to and to see Senator Cruz, well, during those rallies in the Democratic Party in '72, they set off stink bombs. They set off stink bombs during Democratic rallies to disrupt. Yeah, you would. I mean, you really would. The third thing they did, which is probably more common now, is the committee to re-elect the president sent false literature through the mail about the Democratic Party, things that wasn't true. Well, that kind of happens all the time. False literature, you know, pamphlets and information. So they sent false literature through the mail about the Democratic Party. And what was the fourth thing they found out is the reason we're in this hearing? They found out that the committee to re-elect the president stole documents and data from the Democratic political headquarters at Watergate. And that's kind of what we knew about from this point. So they released mice during Democratic press conferences, they set off stink bombs at Democratic rallies, they sent false literature through the mail about the Democratic Party, and they also stole documents and data from the Democratic political headquarters at Watergate. That's why those 5 guys were in there, okay? They were stealing information. Well, that's not all this Watergate investigation found out. They also found out a major piece of information after the testimony of Jeb Stuart Magruder. Okay, so they found out even more damaging information when they interviewed and got the testimony of Jeb Stuart Magruder. He was the deputy director of the committee to re-elect the president. Okay, so they even got more damaging information from the testimony of Jeb Stuart Magruder. He was the deputy director of the committee to re-elect the president. Be like the assistant coach or the assistant principal. He was the deputy director of the committee to re-elect the president. He served under John Mitchell, who resigned, right? Well, he had testimony at these Watergate Senate hearings, and basically what he told the committee was that he and Attorney General John Mitchell and White House lawyer John Dean, all the people we talked about yesterday, he said that himself, Attorney General Mitchell, and White House lawyer John Dean all planned the Watergate burglary. So he ratted out John Mitchell, he ratted out John Dean, and he ratted out himself and told the Senate Watergate Investigating Committee that they all planned that burglary at the Watergate apartment complex. Well, then John Dean got a little nervous after he had been sold out, and he revealed all of the people that were involved in the Watergate break-in. So after being ratted out, John Dean stood up and listed all of the people that were involved in the Watergate break-in. They were all co-conspirators, right? Guess who was on Dean's list? President Nixon. President Nixon. And Dean testified that Nixon not only knew about the Watergate break-in, but for the past 8 months did everything he could to cover it up. Okay, what a bombshell. So during these Senate investigation hearings, Jeb Stuart Magruder rats out himself, Attorney General Mitchell, and White House lawyer John Dean, said they helped plan the burglary. Then John Dean ratted everybody out, including the President of the United States, whom he said not only knew about the Watergate break-in, but during the past 8 months covered it up as well. Now, right in the middle of this, we got another scandal, which is our next little subtopic, and that's the resignation of Vice President Agnew. This happens in the middle of this and has nothing to do with it. But in the middle of this scandal the president's in, we're going to have another scandal involving the vice president. So in the midst of all this controversy surrounding Watergate, Vice President Agnew was involved in his own personal scandal as well. He was under investigation by the Justice Department. He had been under investigation from the Justice Department. Right during this time that we have this big controversy over Watergate. And what happened is the Justice Department revealed 2 things that involved Vice President Agnew and his finances. They investigated 2 things. They had been investigating him because they had heard rumor of some corruption within his finances. And they found 2 things out and revealed it right in the middle of this Watergate controversy. What do you think might be something he did wrong concerning his finances? What? he took some money. He did. He accepted money in return for political favors that he gave large companies while he was governor of Maryland. Okay? He took money in return for giving political favors to large companies while he was governor of Maryland. Does that make sense to you? So he's governor of Maryland. This large company says, boy, we could sure use some legislation that would help us in this manner get something done. He slid him a little money, took care of it for him. That was one thing that he was accused of. Accepting money in return for political favors that he gave large companies while he was governor of Maryland. What else might get you in trouble financially if you don't do it right? That's right, my dear, you don't pay your taxes. And what he did is he failed to report $29,500 on his income tax return in 1967. So they were investigating him for failing to claim $29,500 on his income tax. I wonder where that came from. Any guesses? Kind of ties in maybe, right? From this money that he took. Well, anyway, 1967. So on his 1967 tax reports or files, he failed to report $29,500. So what could he be indicted for? What crimes could he be indicted for? Tax evasion. What else? What happens when you take money? What do they call that? Bribery. And if you do something that might hurt another company because you help this company, that's extortion. Okay? So he basically could have been indicted for tax evasion, bribery, and extortion. Now the bribery and extortion are federal offenses. Is tax evasion a federal offense? It is too. Not maybe as harsh, but it is. So he's got 3 possible federal offenses that they could indict him for. Okay? What's indict mean, by the way? What's that? You're accused of it. If you're indicted on something, you go to trial. Okay? Well, the evidence against Agnew was just overwhelming. So what did he do? Well, before that, I mean, the resignation is part of this. He asked for a plea bargain. Okay? So he knows he's guilty of sin. So because the evidence against Agnew is so overwhelming, he decides to plea bargain for a lighter sentence. Okay? And I'll tell you what he agreed to, and I'll tell you what the court agreed to as a virtue of this plea bargain. What's the first thing he agreed to do? Somebody said it. Resign the vice presidency. So he agreed to resign the vice presidency immediately. He agreed to resign the vice presidency immediately. And normally what's he going to have to do? He's going to have to plead guilty to something, right? What would be the less of the offenses he could plead guilty? Tax evasion, yeah. So he agreed to plead guilty to a single count of tax evasion on the $29,500 he failed to report. So they dropped the bribery and extortion charges, which were by far the most serious, right? So he agrees to resign immediately as vice president. He agrees to plead guilty to a single count of tax evasion on the $29,500 he failed to claim. So what's the court going to give him? I already kind of said one. They're not going to prosecute him for what? Bribery or extortion. That's one thing the court gave back. And he's still going to get in trouble for the tax evasion, so what are they going to promise not to do is the other part? What wouldn't you want to do very bad if you got in trouble for something? Go to jail. That's right. So they promised in return not to prosecute him for extortion and not to sentence him to jail. In return for him resigning the vice presidency and pleading guilty to one single count of tax evasion. This is all right in the middle of this Watergate mess. It's just not good for the country. That's going to make a point on that. What was Agnew's sentence for that? He was fined $10,000 and given 3 years of unsupervised probation. Made money on the deal, right? Okay, so he was given a fine of $10,000 and given 3 years of unsupervised probation. Nevertheless, how was this sentence taken across the country? Horribly criticized. Horribly criticized. Now, the Attorney General at the time was a guy by the name of Elliot Richardson. And he took a lot of heat on this, because who's prosecuting this? The Justice Department is, right? They're the ones that investigated him. The Justice Department's the one that put him on trial. The Justice Department's the one that hired the attorneys and made this deal. And who's the head of the Justice Department? The Attorney General. And the Attorney General at the time just happened to be Elliot Richardson. And he defended this light sentence. He defended it. Now, how could you defend that? What do you think? Think about it. He had a good point. I'm going to read his quote. But how could you defend that sentence? Think about the whole picture. How could you defend it? Yeah, how could you defend, that whole thing encompassing, how do you defend the light sentence? Not the specifics, but the light sentence. How do you defend that to the American people? Think of where we're at. He said, a long trial would have been likely to inflict upon the nation serious and permanent scars. He wanted this to go away, right? Because it was going to do nothing but just scar the Union, especially when we're in the middle of what? Watergate. So he wanted it to go away. He knew we had bigger problems. So Attorney General Elliot Richardson defended that light sentence for Agnew. And somebody mentioned this, and I think they're absolutely right. They did get him out of the vice presidency. That was a big deal, okay? But he said a long trial would have been likely to inflict upon the nation serious and permanent scars. So on October 10th, 1973, Vice President Agnew officially resigned his office as Vice President, okay? October 10th, 1973, Vice President Agnew officially resigned. Now, do we know anything about our constitutional amendments, the 25th Amendment of the Constitution? Who's going to be the new Vice President when Agnew quits? Speaker of the House. Anybody know who the Speaker of the House was at that time? A congressman from Michigan. Turns out to be a president. Never elected by the people, however. Gerald Ford. Okay? So, in accordance with the 25th Amendment, President Nixon nominated Gerald Ford, who was the Republican leader or Speaker of the House, as Vice President. Now, this is a new amendment. We had never had this happen. Prior to this action, any vice presidential vacancies had remained unfilled until the next presidential election. This was the first time that the 25th Amendment of the Constitution was used in our history. And Gerald Ford became the first first Speaker of the House to ascend into the vice presidency. Now, the Senate and the House have to vote on this. You have to, it was Nixon's recommendation, his nomination. And the Senate approved Ford 92-3, and the House 387-35. Senate approved Ford's nomination 92-3, and the House 387-35. Somebody's got to be thinking about something I said earlier. Anybody got a thought of these numbers? Okay, the Senate 92-3, the House 387-35. Why does that ring? I'm waiting for somebody to say, wait a minute. What? 77-0 on what's that mean? So 95 senators. How many senators do we have? 2 in each state. How many is that? 100. So 77-0 and 92-3. What's the deal? Not all of them showed up and vote. Matter of fact, one senator that had a little bit of a reputation of not showing up for votes as much as he should have was John F. Kennedy, to be quite frank with you. So senators don't, if they don't show, they don't count. So that's why you're seeing some discrepancies here. Okay? But you could see that there were some people against Ford's nomination in both the House and the Senate. Not a lot, but some. So, on December 6th of 1973, Gerald Ford was sworn in as Vice President of the United States. Okay? On December 6, 1973, Gerald Ford was sworn in as the Vice President of the United States. So, after after Agnew gets out of office and all that happens, where's the focus going on now? But who in particular after Dean's testimony? Nixon. which will take us to what we know as the White House tapes. The White House tapes. Now, I told you that Nixon was a little paranoid, didn't I? Okay, White House tapes. So, when we get back to the investigation after this vice presidential mess, the big concern is how much does President Nixon know about Watergate? And in July of 1973, they discovered that for the past 2 years, Nixon had been secretly recording, or taping, they called it in those days, everything that went on, all the discussions in the White House. He had taped the White House. He had basically bugged the White House, and he was taping all the conversations. So in July of 1973, it was discovered that for the past 2 years, Nixon had been secretly taping in the White House. So this would include everything said in the Oval Office, right? Everything over White House telephones in any area of the White House, all had been recorded starting 2 years back. He did that. Now, what would this tell the Watergate Committee? Yeah, whether or not he knew anything about it. They've got tapes of every conversation for the past 2 years, either in the Oval Office or over every White House telephone. Okay, they got it all. So what does the Senate Watergate Committee request Nixon do? Turn over the tapes. Okay? Turn over those tapes. He wouldn't do it on the grounds of executive privilege. Okay, he wouldn't turn them over under the philosophy of executive privilege. Now, what's executive privilege mean? Just think about it. Who's the chief executive of the United States? Nixon. So he's using the presidential privilege. You'd have to have a reason. Why? What would be the reason Nixon would say, I'm not going to give those back? I'm not going to give them up. I can't give them up. Other than saying, I'm not giving them to you because they're